Hi, welcome to our monthly meeting of the Cybersecurity and Privacy Working Group in the House. We have these meetings each month by Zoom video conference. I'm here with my co-host, David Heckler, and David is also the editor-in-chief of the TAG Cyber Law Journal, and he is an eminent journalist for many decades in the legal profession and the legal industry. So it's wonderful to have him as our co-host. And I'm delighted today to have Kristina Podnar as our special guest. She's an expert in digital policy. And when I first met Kristina, one of the things that impressed me most was how she really believes in having a living policy. So it's not just something to write up and stick on the shelf to say shield yourself from liability or something of that nature. I think my understanding of Kristina's approach is she really wants people to adopt the policies because they want to adopt them and because they're smart policies and because they'll make your business stronger. So it's a much more positive reason for adopting a coherent digital policy. And I think digital policy is all the more important right now for two reasons. One is we're all working from home, so that sort of mixes things up a little bit. And cybersecurity is just getting ever more important. And that intersection of cybersecurity, privacy, and digital policy is a really interesting one and a really meaty topic. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. David, I'm going to pass the torch to David, and why don't you get the discussion started?
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, Kristina Podnar. Kristina has an MBA in International Business and is a consultant now under the banner of her Native Trust Consulting, LLC. She spent 2 decades working in the digital world. If you read the interview that we did with her at TAG Cyber Law Journal, you can get some great little stories about lessons learned on the front lines, the early days of the web. I really appreciate your candor and your storytelling ability, Kristina, and I think it really brought that to life. We're going to talk about policies in a minute, different kinds of policies related to cybersecurity, but I want to start with a small question that we kind of stumbled into, and I want to sort of lay it out front and center here. If we talk about working from home, is there really any difference in saying working from home or working remotely? What's the difference?
So thank you, first of all, for asking that question. Very few people actually stop to think about the context. And I think that context is so important for policy. At the moment, a lot of us are working from home or maybe from our in-laws, depends on where you were caught when this all went down. But as we open back up, as we go back to some kind of operations, whether, I don't want to call it operations as normal, because there's no such thing as normal. We're not going back to where we were in January. But before this event and after this event, we're going to continue to work in other places. And it's not necessarily going to be at home. And context matters. Because if you're at home, you might be on your own Wi-Fi network. If you're working perhaps from a coffee shop, you're going to be on their Wi-Fi network potentially. And for a lot of folks today, especially in corporate employee settings, I actually see people in the parking lots of libraries because their home network has become overtaxed with kids online trying to chat with their teachers, get their work done, spouses, perhaps in-laws staying with them, etc. So I think context is important because the risk and the opportunities within that context differ, and we need to be very cognizant of that and not assume that it's all equal.
Okay, thank you. You're talking to probably almost all lawyers, so
Yay!
I'm thinking that we are going to have a slightly different view of this question than a typical, more heterogeneous audience. But should all companies have digital policies, and do they need to be written down? It's the last part of that question that I think there's going to be a certain divide on.
Absolutely. So, first of all, yay for lawyers. And I say that because, as you and I have talked before, I believe that lawyers, especially in-house counsel, general counsel, does not get enough credit, and they don't take enough of the stage as they ought to in the digital policy space. So let me just invite everybody to do that and to focus on supporting and enabling their enterprise or their clients or their partners, because I think that the value there is untapped for the organization or for the business, and I think that that's really important. So with that being said, yes, every organization ought to have policies. Everybody needs to understand what are the risks and what are the opportunities that come with digital, whether that's working from home, whether it's tapping artificial intelligence and machine learning for new types of marketing, whether it's using social media or chatbots or mobile apps, whatever it is, there is a slew of digital policy. And I'm not saying you need one for every topic. What I'm saying is that you need to understand the range, and you need to understand for what aspects of that range do you want to set up a policy? What are the aspects that absolutely must either be taken advantage of for the organization, or where do you want to limit risk? And it's really the balancing out of those two things that needs to be put in place. And so yes, ideally everybody would document this. How formal is documented, I think depends very much on the organization. I think I've mentioned to you before, David, and I'll share with everybody else today. I have a colleague I've worked with now for about, more than years than I care to think of, probably about 13 years. And we have some fundamental policies. They're in place. We've discussed them. We adhere to them religiously, believe it or not, but they're not written down. And it's fine, and it works because there's two of us, and because we're like-minded, and we do business together, and it's fine. That model will never scale for a larger enterprise because you're going to get too many people who are of differing minds, and it's not going to work. So I think it's important to understand the context, and is it enough to be informal? Is it enough to maybe just write something down and slap it on the rim of the lunchroom door, or do you really need a more formal written policy? Regardless, though, of what anybody decides to do, let me suggest that policies shouldn't be shelfware, as Chris mentioned at the beginning of this call. I think in a lot of instances, we like to have, 7 to 10 page policies. They're beautifully written in legalese. They have a lot of corporate signatures on them. They get PDF'd, they get put on SharePoint, and nobody ever looks at them again, right? And that's almost criminal, right? I mean, that's criminal, it's a crime. People actually need to be aware of what policies are. They need to actually be adopting them, implementing them, applying them into the work environment. It needs to actually just be how we live and breathe, which means that when you create policies, that artifact, the actual writing down of a policy, needs to be a byproduct of the process that you use to develop and disseminate and implement the policies themselves. So yes, I'm sure that we can have a debate around, ought everybody to write them down? I tend to be somebody who kind of, from my consulting experiences, not always. But again, it's all about the risk and the balance inside of your organization or with your clients. And it's about supporting and enabling them to do the right thing, and also to do the right thing for the business, not necessarily for themselves or their department or their initiative, but really for the business.
Now, we all know that there are workforces that are entirely remote these days, which is quite different than, say, 6 months ago when people would occasionally work from home. Do there need to be formal cybersecurity policies specifically aimed at remote work?
Now more than ever. And I think that they need to be very exhaustive. And so what I've actually done in the last 2 months is I've taken a look not only at my clients' remote working policies, but I've looked at what other organizations have put out there as quote unquote their best practice. And oftentimes what I see is maybe a paragraph or two around what does working remotely mean? And it usually means abiding by IT policies. But when we're working from home or when we're working remotely, it has to do with so much more than just use a VPN. It has to do with being really smart about the context that you're in. It certainly does have to do with awareness. Things like, if I'm actually working from home, have I encrypted my password strongly enough to protect my home network? Do I scan the network regularly? If there is somebody who hacks into my router, how will I respond, or how will I know? There are all kinds of considerations from that perspective. But then there are also these notions of people really letting their guard down because they're in a familiar environment and they do things that might be okay personally for them, but they're not okay when it starts to come to the business environment. And one of the examples that I've used for that is this really great support the class of 2020 thing that we've all been seeing going around Facebook or Instagram. Everybody wants to support these graduating seniors or graduating college folks who can't, walk down the aisle and receive their diploma. So they've been posting high school photos of themselves, from years on, but they're not stopping to think that, wow, when I actually started my job and I originally set my password, right, that password had a secret question associated with it, and maybe it was my high school mascot. Or maybe it was the year I graduated, or maybe it was which high school I went to. And right off the bat, we've created the perfect, scenario, the perfect storm for social engineering and a cybersecurity event without thinking about it. And we've all of a sudden married up our personal and our professional life in a way that isn't just going to impact us in the near term, right? Things like having a cyber incident, but also if you stop and think about it for the longer term, things like using all of that data for artificial intelligence, for mining, for social engineering for years to come is where the weaknesses will be created. And so I think it's really important to understand that working from home is very different. It's very different at this moment, and it's going to continue to be very different going forward. So don't just tell people to turn on their VPN. Tell them everything they need to know, from how to patch their own devices if they're using their own device, right, to what they can and can't do with their work device, as well as just awareness and really basic hygiene that we ought to have been practicing all these years, but we didn't because we felt very safe and secure within these four walls.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to stop and invite our participants to ask their own questions.
Okay.
So the question is, can companies monitor and enforce the rules that they establish in these policies, and should they do that?
Right, and that's really the loaded question. When I look at it, the first thing that I ask is, why do you want to monitor those practices, and is it worth the investment that it's going to take to get that done? So yes, you certainly could monitor it, but consider the fact that you're actually in somebody's home. So you don't actually, as a company, you don't own my home. You can't necessarily tell me what to do inside of my own home. You can tell me what I have to do with your device when it's inside of my home. And so what I think is really important to remember is that you can actually educate people and get them to do more things by kind of using the carrot approach, which is education and enablement and support, rather than trying to enforce something and then monitor people from a big brother approach perspective. And so, yes, I think you can. I think there's limits to what you can do, both legally and practically. And I think it's worth asking the question, is that investment worth the return that the business is going to get? Or can you really bring people on board to create a secure and mindful environment where, regardless of where somebody is, they're constantly thinking about the things you want them to remember? And I think, a great example that I would use for my own personal life is a few days ago, I was sitting with my son who's in middle school, and we were taking a photo. His teacher asked if we could do a photo that shows him working wherever he's working at the moment. And so we did a selfie, and I have my laptop, he has his laptop. And I thought, oh, this is so cute, I want to share it, on Facebook. And then I paused. I paused for a moment because my laptop might be okay, right? The only thing you're going to see on my laptop is branding of my digital policy and my, my hobby, which is bat housing. But for my middle schooler, he actually has the RFID tag for his laptop that the school issued with his name and his middle school name on it. Sharing that into the Facebook environment is not smart, it's not wise, it's not good, right? But I had to actually pause, right? So here I am, a policy consultant who was like, oh, let me leap. And then I kind of went, whoa, stop yourself, check yourself. Is that smart? Is it wise? Is it helpful? Right? And then I was like, yep, not going to do that one. Right? So I think we all have to think about that. And I think it's really, really easy to kind of get carried away in the moment and get excited and to be sort of emotionally letting yourself relax because you're in a familiar environment. But you have to actually nest into everybody the belief of self-checking themselves and give them the tools and the knowledge and the insight to get that done.
So David,
Just
before
say-
you open up the floor, could I ask a follow-up question?
Just wait a second, 1 second.
Yep.
One of the things you said in your answer to that question when we talked is that it's really a win-win situation, because the kinds of things that the company wants you to do when you're working remotely are the kinds of things that protect you and your family. So, it's to everyone's benefit. Rather than coming across as the cop, you come across as the enabler to make this person, this family, this group of people safe everywhere they are.
Absolutely. And, I mean, just on that point, I would ask everybody on the call today, does everybody have two-factor authentication enabled for themselves and for their company? There's a practice that you should have, whether you're an organization or an individual, right? Privacy, security, even things like copyrights, right? They apply to an organization, but they apply to us as individuals. If you've ever gone off to create a PowerPoint or some kind of a really funny thing and you've just grabbed an image by Googling it and saving it to your local drive and then uploading it, you're actually infringing on somebody's copyright, whether you're a business, if you're an individual. Same thing with security, right? You're in a network, you're in an environment that you as an individual control. Yes, I'm inviting the organization into my house, but if you can make that a stronger, better environment for everybody, then it goes back to your point, David, which is win-win, smarter, better, stronger employees, and they'll be smarter not just at home. They're going to be smarter as we all go back to work, or we go into the coffee shops, or we go wherever life might take us.
Chris?
Yes, absolutely. Just a quick comment on that. A prior guest on this discussion had a great joke. He said, when it comes to cybersecurity, it's like walking in the woods with a friend. If you get attacked by a bear, you don't need to be faster than the bear. You just need to be faster than your friend. So these hackers will go after the soft targets. If you have, if you have the kind of two-factor authentication, if you have a password vault, and if you have other types of protections, you're probably not going to be the victim. So I think that's a really excellent point. So my question is a follow-up to the earlier discussion of how do employers help their employees, lawyers and other employees, be cyber secure. And it reminds me, and now I'm going to date myself, I guess, because I remember a time in the 90s and the early part of this century where we had two devices, right? We got a company issued BlackBerry. We got a company issued laptop. And it was the company's problem. The expense was their problem. The security was their problem. And one thing I'm wondering is maybe we need to go back to the future a little bit and think about maybe companies should be issuing additional secure equipment for their employees to use, especially because there's been a lot of miniaturization. So you can have a really fantastic laptop that hardly weighs a thing, and you could take it back and forth to work even when we go back to work. And you could have a company issued cell phone, and then the company would control the environment and also be responsible for the expense. Because I also think it's unfair to put the expense on employees and basically insist that they use their own equipment to conduct company business. So any thoughts on that and whether that might be an approach that employers should look at?
I have lots of thoughts. One of those is, I don't think we should actually go backwards. I don't think that having dual devices is going to really solve a lot of the problems that we're encountering. I think it's a Band-Aid approach. It can be helpful in certain instances. When I was talking with David, I brought up, or maybe even with you, Chris, I brought up this issue of the EPA, who had a communication specialist a few years ago, and that individual was using the same device for their personal communication and for work. And it just so happens that they accidentally tweeted out a promotion for Kim Kardashian's latest app via the EPA's Twitter account. And, there was a lot of embarrassment, and it wasn't really horrible, but, it wasn't the best. And so there are instances where it might be better to actually have an official device and completely segregate that official device from your personal device. But on the whole, we've actually gone towards organizations practicing this bring your own device model because it works, it's easier, people like having their own known environments, etc. So I don't think it's so much about introducing new devices and having duplications of everything as it is becoming smarter about what happens when you use your personal device and very clear roles and responsibilities around that. Who's accountable for that device? If I'm doing work on that device, Is my employer going to be liable if that device gets hacked? Will they be covered by their own insurance policy? Doesn't matter where I'm located. You know, for a lot of folks working, for example, in the financial sector, I have a client who didn't realize that one of the individuals that they were employing decided to shelter at home during this crisis, but he forgot to mention that he was sheltering at home from India because his home is in India. And now we have a device that's sitting in India, right, with the potential or the prospect of being hacked, being lost, et cetera, and it's not even in the United States of America, which is a liability from a security perspective, liability from an insurance perspective, et cetera. And so I think more devices increases the risk in terms of more things being lost. And so I don't really see that as being the solution. I think having really smart policies in place that help us bring this environment together, balance out those risks and opportunities, train everybody. And it's not even about training, because training implies a one-time effort, or those really silly movies and videos and quizzes that we do once a year to refresh our knowledge, right? Let's not do that. Let's actually do something different, which is let's really create smart policies that are applicable, that work, that aren't shelfware, and that invite people to participate and do the right thing, and then you reward them. And I've seen that work, by the way, in practice. I've seen both the sort of the stick and the carrot work. The carrot meaning, you know, I had a friend whose company does all-in awards. So if you do something smart, they give you $5 for Best Buy or Starbucks or someplace else. And so they actually would audit and take a look at who has what kind of practices. And they'd give you a high five if you did a good job and a little monetary kind of recognition. How great is that? And then I have a former client in the financial industry sector that can't afford to be hacked. And they do something very differently. They do the stick approach, which is they train and test their employees. The first time you don't pass a phishing exercise, so it's where they deliberately try and invite you to click on clickbait. They actually come back to you, they talk to you, they counsel you, they re-educate you. The second time that you fail the test and you actually click on the link, they escort you out of the building and you're done. You're fired.
Wow.
And that policy applies to everybody, including the C-suite. Guess what? Zero hacks, zero security incidences, because people are taking that one seriously as well. And so I think there's definitely a lot of different options, but I don't think multiple devices are it. I think really creating a sustainable culture that pays attention to security, privacy, and has that as its DNA is really the answer.
Let's open it up to questions. Chris, can you unmute people?
Yes, there's a few. Let me unmute all. And anyone who wants to ask a question out loud, we also
I have a question.
Yes, Brenda.
So it's following up on this whole personal devices. In our company, we have work laptops, and so thank you for focusing on that. There are a couple of things in this environment. People are more lax than they would be when they're working in the office. We have a mixed organization with a lot of people who were working from home. But the concern that we have as a company would be, what do we do about the personal devices if for some reason someone's no longer with the company? Can we actually go in and wipe the devices and then return them? And then how would we enforce that in this work from home environment? Because it's still fluid, right? We're adding people are leaving. And we have a concern about the confidential information. We're a healthcare technology company, so PHI, intellectual property, trade secrets. So yes, I agree you shouldn't have two. But what do you do about deleting the information on the personal devices, be they cell phones or laptops?
Great question.
Absolutely, a great question. And what I would say is start with this notion of where information can be stored. So for example, and this is sort of a funny example, but I actually own this laptop and I also own the company that I work for, but my company actually owns all of the data that I actually have. And the way that we've done that is I've created two really admin accounts. One is assigned to my company, the other one is assigned to me. And then there's actually a user profile that's associated with the company account. And so that company account can actually erase all of my access and literally lock me out of my laptop. Okay, and so that's how we've dealt with that, and that's actually how a lot of people deal with it. The other part is you can actually set up environments where people actually sort of tunnel into their work environment. They have access to all of the tools that they need. They can save things on our local desktop, right? But it's really based on a server rather than their laptop. And so the idea is that they're working in a virtual environment and you continue to retain all of the ownership of that environment. And I think that's really, really smart, because what it starts to do is not just control things like email and local storage drive, but you can control whether or not people can copy and paste or export that data into things like Google Sheets or Google Drives, or places that people see as a really easy and fast way to collaborate, but aren't necessarily aligned with the ownership and the data rights of your organization and what you want to do. And that's an interesting area that I personally see the biggest weakness. In fact, when I do a lot of compliance audits around things like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, when I come in, people go, oh, I think we have our handle on this. And I always go, okay, great. You know, show me your Google Drives, right? The individuals, not the corporate ones, and let me kind of start poking. And what I find is that data leakage that's unintentional is the biggest issue of the problem. And so trying to, I think, keep your hands on all of that information is critical, as well as that main working environment. And that's where that comprehensive policy comes in terms of what you can do, what you can't do, and ultimately, how do you support and enable the workforce to get something done with the tools they have. So for example, asking the questions of, why do you need to export this information to a Google Sheet? Is Excel not going to work for you? Who are you trying to collaborate with that they actually need to be, that data needs to be in a Google Sheet? Is there a reason that we can't use existing tools? And if not, that's cool. I'll support and enable you, and I'll look at other tools that are appropriate, but I'm going to retain ownership of that data. And you as the employee are here performing a service for the business. Yes, you are a partner, but you don't own the data that you produce. That is actually ownership of the business, and it'll be retained as such.
So Richard wanted to ask a question, so I just want to give Richard the floor if you're ready to ask your question.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, it's Richard. I'm based in the UK. I work in financial technology. So we're not a regulated entity, but our clients are. And the policy point is interesting because we have to write everything down because we are subject to what's called a SOC 2 audit. And you have to write down what you're going to do, and then you have to do what you've written down. So there's an absolute policy point. One observation about personal devices and corporate devices is I think that as everyone's working from home now, there's a real social point about making sure people understand the boundary between when to work and when not to work. And if you're asking them to work on a personal device, there's a real risk, I believe, that people are going to work 15, 18, 20, 22 hours a day because their device is with them all the time, and therefore they end up working when actually, if this work from home policy goes on for an extended period, which it looks like it's going to for at least some of us, I think it is a problem for people's mental health. And so, I mean, for example, I have 2 devices. They're both mine personal devices, but I've chosen to have a corporate personal phone precisely so I can turn it off and not be at work. And I think that part of this whole story has to be thought through. But my question really was going back to the policy point is that as people are now no longer going to be in the office as much, whatever the new normal looks like, I think there's going to be an awful lot more remote working. And people I've been doing it for 20 years, but people are new to this. Is it credible to say you don't write policies down, or do you think we're going to get to a point where actually expectation is that you have to write things down because it's the only way to make sure people are seeing it, because they're not in the office to be checked on?
So I think that, again, I kind of go back to this notion of what environment do you work in terms of writing things down or not. So you're providing a really great example of where policies have to be written down, right, in order to actually stay compliant with regulations or even your own internal audit. So again, I kind of come back and say, look, fit for purpose. Don't just write stuff down. And I'm coming from the perspective of having too much shelfware, right, which we write everything down, but nobody does it. And that's the point that I'm rallying against. Don't do that. Right? Instead, kind of flip it on its head, make sure you're doing it and writing it down if that's the appropriate thing to do. And in terms of, I think your point is really, really valid, by the way. Let me just back up a second, because you said something that I think is really critical here, which is making sure that people are working the hours that they ought to be working, whether it's the right amount and not sort of slacking off, quote unquote, or working just the right amount versus overworking in environments where they shouldn't be working. I think that in terms of the employment space, we need to actually adopt more flexibility, and that's going to be called for. If you think about how many people are working from home right now, well, that's pretty much everybody unless you're essential. You're probably working in a situation where you're caring either for elderly parents, a sibling, a spouse, a partner, your children who you're trying to homeschool, etc. And so even though my laptop might be here 8 or 10 or 12 hours a day, doesn't mean that I'm working 8 or 12 or 10 hours a day. And so I think that there needs to be more flexibility in terms of being able to track what I really work versus what I don't work, and a greater focus on outputs rather than just the hours that we have in fact worked. I think that all of that has to be put into a really big mixing bowl that accounts for things also like who gets promoted, right? So when it comes to promotion time, how are we going to evaluate promotions based on merit? And how are you going to do that in an environment that's remote? How are you going to lay people off if you have to lay them off, or even if you have to fire them for non-compliance with their work duties, etc. So there's a lot to be considered there, I think, that's beyond just sort of work from home versus work from the office. It's really about how do we work with people, and how do we work with people in this existing context of structure. And that does boil down to things like, do we need to have 2 devices or not? That might be a preference of yours, and it might be a preference of a lot of people that I know. And so that might need to be an option, right? Both in terms of the context of the business and the context of the employees. I personally don't think that that's, for the majority of people out there, the way to go. But again, I would take a look at the risk and the opportunity that is present for the business, and it might be the right kind of investment, especially depending on the vertical that you find yourself in.
Yeah, there's also software tools on these devices, right, where you can put them to sleep. So you could have you can almost have a work section of your device that sort of goes to sleep by default at 7 p.m. so that people can be with their families. So I think there's software fixes too that could be applied to sort of set those boundaries.
There are, but this is why I think that you really have to look at the users, and it's about supporting and enabling those users and understanding the use cases. So I can't say to you, you know what, at 7 o'clock your device is going to go to sleep, and at 7 o'clock my device is going to go to sleep, because I can tell you I log on at 9 o'clock at night because it's the only time it's actually quiet in my house. So that device better not be sleeping, because I'm not sleeping, and I won't sleep until the morning then. But I think that it's more about, I think, the intent and the context and what you train people to do, right? The reality is that people can break any kind of rule almost that we put in place, right? The great example is, I gave you a device, you're responsible for it, you're working from home, you've checked the boxes, but you're right, I never told you can't take your device to India and work from there, right? And so, that's a loophole, which is why I come back to look at what are people really trying to do, support and enable them in terms of what are they trying to get done for the business, but then make sure that you put those guardrails, because that's what policies are. They're guardrails to make sure that people don't fly in their car off the highway and cause this really insane level of damage to the business. But I think that requires all of us to take another look at how do we operate? Because what we've done right now, right, we had this really crazy thing happen to us all, and it disrupted us. And so what we did is we went like, oh, we're not working at the office, now we're working from home. That's actually not true, right? We went from this is how we used to work to at this very moment we're working from home, but everything is kind of changing, right? And it's not just working from home, because in a month you probably won't be working from home. You might be working from, the library where the Wi-Fi is more reliable if the library is open back up again. Or you might be working from your in-laws because we unleash some of the restrictions, but not all of them, and you can actually be with your kind of extended family, but not with 100 people. And so I think that you need to consider what can that look like, and what are the risks and the benefit to the business in operating in that new norm, and consider the extremes, right? Consider these kind of outliers and the edges, because that's the thing that kind of gets us in trouble. It's never like the straight on 50% of the case, right? Some people are just driving down their lane, they're going to do what you tell them to do. And then there are the outliers, not necessarily deliberately doing the crazy dance, but they end up doing the crazy dance because the music sounds right. And we want to make sure that we say, yep, you can do your crazy dance, but don't hit people while you're doing it.
I wanted to make sure we recognize, we'll get to the questions in the chat window, but Scott wanted to ask a question. So go ahead, Scott.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the presentation. Really appreciate it. First, a comment, then a question. I think when we think about working from home and cybersecurity, I think we have to think of it slightly broader as information security as well, where cyber is just one piece of it. If I have my laptop secure, but I print out that data and I don't shred it, or I print out that data and I hold on to it and I have a records retention policy, am I really thinking clearly? And so the broader information security, I think, needs to be thought through in terms of cyber being one piece of it. But focusing on something else that you said, I have a question for you, which is the educate approach that's interactive, adult learning, and helpful. Um, if you wanted to think about the training as not just one and done, but on some kind of periodic basis, do you have any suggestions or experience for particular trainings that you have found for your clients are helpful in terms of, oh, I just watched that last year, it was good then, but do I have to sit through it again? But are there any companies or that would fit into your category that you're describing where it's not just one and done, but it's something that's helpful and encouraging and perhaps interactive in the pedagogical approach, but it's achieving that reminder, educate mindset on a continual basis. So even for the folks who are good actors, there's no patch for cyber stupidity, but by educating on a regular basis through interesting interactive trainings, you can buy down some risk. And so the question is, what trainings, how often would you encourage the trainings, and what trainings have you found satisfy what you would say would be important criteria?
Thank you. So that's actually a really great question. And I love that because you can always teach an old dog a new trick, and I'm evidence of that. And I'll give you a personal story here. So I actually think that we're pretty savvy, right, in terms of like security in my household. I'm actually married to a SharePoint architect geek. It's not a good thing. It's a good marriage, but not a good thing. And, you know, when I look at how our home network is configured, we do the right things, right? We segregate our IoT devices. So my dishwasher and my washer and my coffee maker are on a separate network than where my work laptop lands, which is very different than the segregated part of my network where guests log on to when they just come over and want to play Minecraft with my son, etc. So we've been very mindful in that manner. But what's interesting to me is probably about 4 months ago or so, I walked into one of my clients' buildings, and next to the elevator, they have this little screen, and it plays different messages every day while people are waiting to go up and down, either to lunch or get to their office. And it said, you know everything there is to know about security, but have you considered a biometric device? We have them available for you. And it's interesting because I use it on my phone, but I hadn't been thinking about it for my laptop, and I hadn't been thinking about it for use on my client's laptop. And so that's what they do, and that's what I see a lot of organizations doing and moving towards, and that I would actually applaud. So moving away from these one and done videos that realistically most of us don't listen to. In fact, I usually mute those videos and then just click, click, click and take the test. Like that's my modus operandus. I usually get 90% or above, I get my certificate and I move on. Right? And so the organizations that are looking to move away from that are implementing policies and guidance, whether it's a policy or it's a standard or it's just best practice. They're doing it in context of where the people are, right? So it's the put up a message next to the elevator, and this is like our moving issue or this moving month. There's a lunch and learn in the cafeteria, right, where somebody's actually speaking to get it done. It's the tip of the day as you log onto your computer, right? Like this morning, this is funny. We did this in my company. We did like a little flash message to everybody saying, hey, did you see the new phishing scam? And it's funny because the new phishing scam that went out yesterday via LinkedIn, if anybody saw it, actually in the URL had the word phishing as part of the URL. And so for us, it was sort of like a funny thing, but it was also a good way to just kind of like do a little pop-up of like, remember, right, whenever you're getting in a URL from somebody you don't know, don't just, click on it, etc. Also look at the URL because it can give you a clue as to this is not valid, it's not expected, it's not okay. And so I think that embedding these policies and these practices and sort of meeting people where they are, educating that way, and educating 365 days a year is the way to go. So you're not just doing it once and done. It's not a, here's everything you need to know, because you're going to retain probably only 10% of it anyway. It's really about little bits and bytes for everybody as you go. Now, the challenge with that is that it takes a lot more time and effort and resources, right? It actually takes a far more deliberate way of thinking about this. And that's where I go back and ask the C-level folks that I work with in organizations and say, how much is security worth to you? How much is it worth to you? Like, at what level do you want to do this at? And the once and done, that might be good enough, depending on who you are and what risks we face. That might be good enough, and you'll check the box and you'll move on. Or I work with a biopharma that does, a lot of different venues and a lot of different training, and meets users where they are, whether it's logging on to the screen, whether it's the elevator, whether it's just a little pop-up message in their cubicle, whether it's the high five, you've done a good job because somebody observed that you did a good job. And we wanted to call that out in recognition of the entire company. Right? So in that instance, you're just rewarding really good behavior and reminding everybody in the company that, gosh, Scott did a really great job. You know what? He thwarted this phishing attack today. Here's the scenario in which it happened. Thanks, Scott. Here's $5 for a certificate to Starbucks. Just want to give you kudos once again. Applaud from everybody. Hurrah. So I would encourage those types of efforts and training and constant awareness and vigilance versus the once and done.
I'm going to have to grab the mic again because we promised, this would be false advertising if I didn't get to this question. We promised to ask about policies before the remote workers return to the office, if that actually happens. But should companies establish formal digital policies and cybersecurity policies before workers come back to the office, and why is that important?
Yes, please, please, please add this to your list of to-dos. Especially, I can't say this enough times, like from a legal perspective, you have power like nobody else has, and you have voice to ask the questions, right? So ask your organization, are we doing the right things and preparing for people to come back into the office, whether starting to work on official devices from a remote location or it's physically coming back into the building? Everything from how are you going to actually track people who walk through the door and what they're touching, and do they need PPE, right? Which isn't a digital policy. It might be if you communicate that via email. But think about the physical aspects and then think also about the digital aspects. So if you're coming back onto our environment, onto our network, do we need to patch something before you do that? What are the devices you're bringing into the building? If you're bringing your home laptop, right, that might be okay, but maybe I want to segregate the part of the network that you're sitting on until I have a chance to understand that your device is patched, that it's well protected. You're not bringing along malware that you've picked up at home on your home network back into the physical environment. It's things like social engineering practices, following you into the workplaces. Have we almost scrubbed you from that perspective? There's so many different ways to think about this and do this. I can't stress that enough. And we've already started to see so many organizations that are getting targeted with false emails and false requests. Things like, hey, while you were out, I talked to the CFO, we're bidding on this contract, I need these resumes sent to me in order to include them in the proposal. Turns out a spoof. Sounded really great, completely spoofed, and a way to start social engineering. So think about it right now. Think about it from the physical to the security to getting your people up to speed and telling them what they need to look for as they're stepping back into that world, whether it's physically or virtually, but definitely protect yourself.
And Victor in the chat window asked a question about personal and business mixing, commingling, and he used the word liability. What is a company's liability for your work at home? And how does insurance figure into this mix? Are companies generally that have cyber policies generally covered for what may happen remotely?
So as a lot of the folks on the call today probably know, there are different levels of liability, right? Employers' comp will usually cover people when they trip at home on the power cord and break their leg, right? Because they've been actually working from home. This actually is an interesting instance because you can't make that assumption in the pandemic era. A lot of insurance companies have said, you know what, I'm sorry, this is actually a completely different thing. We're not going to cover you. And they're looking for a lot of escape clauses because what's happened is there's been such an incredible amount of cyber attacks, cyber phishing, any kind of vulnerabilities from a security perspective that they're not looking to cover those. So I would say go back and actually check your policy and ask your representative the questions of, are we really covered? I think you might be surprised that in a lot of instances you are not, and that you might actually need to adjust if people continue to work from home so that you are in fact protected. And the level of protection, that you have needs to be revisited, not just from a global corporate perspective, but think back to all of the local markets in which you might have a presence and check to see, are you protected for those local markets if you are multinational or if you work in different territories.
So this is part of the job I don't like. We only have 3 minutes left. So I think there were some questions in the chat window, but unfortunately we had so many good questions out loud that I don't think we're going to get to all the questions in the chat window. Kristina, not to put you on the spot, but would you be willing to share your email so people could get in touch with you with questions they might have?
Absolutely. You can actually feel free to ask me anything. I'm usually somebody who generously gives. If I can help you, I'll help you, and I won't charge you as a consultant for anything that's like reasonable. So feel free to shoot me an email, or you can also tweet at me if you're a Twitter. My email is me at KPOD as in dog, N as in Nancy, A as in Apple, R as in Roger.com. But if you just want to go to thepowerofdigitalpolicy.com, you'll be able to get in touch with me. You'll get to my LinkedIn profile, Twitter, and all that other good stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I guess we maybe have time for one quick question if anybody has anything else, or we can David, otherwise I'll give it to you to get the last word.
Anyone?
No, fantastic.
Okay. How much time we got? 2 minutes. Physical, I guess you touched on physical hygiene, Kristina. That can also create all kinds of liability issues for companies when people are coming back. And I don't know if you can answer in 2 minutes, but what do you think companies ought to be doing as far as formal policies concerning physical hygiene when people come back to the office?
So you know what, 2 minutes isn't enough to go through everything. You're absolutely right. But there's always some basics, right? You need to make sure that all of the doorknobs are regularly clean, that you actually have the sanitation in place. In fact, before you actually go in and lock those doors, unless you already started to unlock them, this is a great time to get cleanup crews inside, get as much of the cleanup done as possible, and then make sure that you have regular intervals of cleaning. Try to stagger work times for people if you possibly can. That's another really great advice. Make sure that if you're asking people to protect themselves, protect others, that you're giving out PPE if you can. Also take a look at the liability you do have from providing PPE for people. So important point, right? It kind of goes both ways. So be mindful of that. And most of all, the biggest tip I would have is be mindful of the fact that if you're bringing people back into a physical building, okay, one of the biggest ways that we're hearing people getting reinfected is actually through the HVAC system, right? Especially in the US, not as much of an issue, I think, for a lot of European companies that don't have central HVAC systems. But think about that aspect and the liability you might have in a physical sense if you're actually spreading the virus through your HVAC system, and understand what kind of cleaning and liability you might have, including the decreased liability from having your HVAC system folks come in and regularly update those filters, or even put UV bulbs and cleaning filters that are much better in terms of HIPAA quality in place.
Thank you. Thank you for appearing. The video we just finished will be up on the up on the In the House resource page very soon, right, Chris?
Yeah, I should be able to get it up there tomorrow.
All right, and the two articles I wrote interviewing Kristina will also be there. One is similar to what we just discussed. One is just on digital policies in general at companies and what role lawyers should be playing in that process. Anyway, thanks very much, Kristina. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Chris, for hosting, as usual.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Kristina. You guys can always go to www.inthehouse.org if you want to learn more about our organization and how we try to support general counsel and other in-house counsel. And Kristina, fantastic job, very informative, and really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Great questions. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.